Welcome back. If you somehow mixed a Disney character with Todd McFarlane's flair for storytelling, energetic poses, and a handful of grit, you would have Joe Madureira. What makes this series a little bit different to our usual is that most of the time we will have the pencils to compare to the actual finished artwork, which gives us such an incredible insight into Joe's work. So strap on in, let's take a deep dive into Joe Madureira's artwork. Step 1. Proportions. When it comes to proportions, Joe takes the standard proportions that we all know, love and use every day, throws them out the window, and changes proportions based on each individual character. And he does this by using their own individual character personalities to change the proportions per character. So, let's have a deep dive into this and I can show you what I mean. If we look at this beefcake guy in the very first panel of the very first issue, his head is basically the size of a pea and his torso is approximately 5 head widths instead of the usual 3 or 4. But it looks absolutely awesome because he combines his skills for expression, storytelling and anatomy really well. As for height, people, particularly males, can also be heckin' tall. We can see the height difference between Inhumans and ordinary pesky humans in some of these panels. When it comes to drawing males, Joe likes to emphasise certain areas, but then flatten other areas different to your typical comic artist. Trapezius muscles are one of the areas where he exaggerates the definition and size. He makes them much larger and taller than the standard hero or human proportions, which in turn makes the heads look smaller. Another area he typically enhances is male legs. Every buff dude has absolute tree trunks. These decisions are, I think, done to make the characters look more powerful, domineering, and much stronger to the viewer. One surprising area of anatomy to me was how flat he draws his male characters' pectorals. This is across the board. Buff or skinny, pectorals are generally more stretched out and less pronounced than other artists of his time. As for the non-buff males, everyone's average weight seems to be on the slightly skinny side. As most of the characters are heckin' buff, we can see Joe's version of average in background characters such as bystanders and pedestrians. With female proportions, he does keep in mind the more stereotypical proportions we find in comics, small waists and bigger hips. However, he also makes sure that women have their own strongly defined chiseled detail too. In this opening shot of Medusa, we can see he emphasises her abs, her deltoid and hip bones using shadow, which as we know in comics is typically reserved only for males to this degree. I personally appreciate that he remembered that women can also be strong as heck too. Step 2. Line work. Before we get into the real nitty gritty of what makes Joe figures great, I need to explain to you about his line work, because if I don't, the rest of this video and the rest of this series won't make a lot of sense. His line work is somehow both straight and curved at the same time. It is composed of lines that are either very slightly curved or completely straight, and then when it changes direction, it doesn't do so with a sharp point. It's a very small curve. To best explain this, I've gathered some images from my favourite artists. So here we have artwork by David Finch, Mark Silvestri, Jim Lee, and of course, Joe Mad. From this collection we can see that the closest in terms of line choice is probably David Finch. And surprisingly, Jim and Mark are almost polar opposite to Joe's. If we look at the trapezius and bicep areas, we can see where David and Joe start to differ. Joe prefers fundamentally almost straight lines, whereas David will bend lines more freely to give the muscle a more realistic tone. Step 3. Muscle definition. Joe, combined with colorist Marta Gracia, have a wonderful way of making muscles look like they're literally made out of stone, as if the character was sculpted from rock. So let's have a look. This was the first panel that made me really hold my breath and think, How in the heck? Just look at it. Those forearm muscles literally feel like they are solid slabs of rock. Thankfully, we have the pencils of this page to compare. So let's take a look. If we look at Lash's right arm for starters and compare them to the pencils, if we look closely, Marta has added quite a bit of muscle definition himself. There are some extra striations on the deltoid and extra marks on the forearm. And what makes it absolutely awesome is how he managed to add definition to large areas of no detailing and then add tiny highlight spots to small details to make them look very 3D. Doing this, he emphasises the planes of the anatomy, making them feel solid and chiselled. In other panels, particularly for buff Inhumans and New Humans, Marta emphasises Joe's work, taking the hint of striations noted in the pencils and then emphasising them with the colouring, as we can see often with Lash. Step 4. Poses. For me, one of the best signs of an artist is how they can transfer personality, thoughts and feelings even into the most smallest of moments. Hello, what are you doing? And what I mean by this is, if you ignore the giant climactic fight scenes and you go to an ordinary, quote-unquote boring scene, can they transfer the character to those smaller moments and make it look awesome? And Joe Mad absolutely can. In this opening shot of Queen Medusa, she is sat up in her bed. But if you or I had been woken up in the middle of the night, would we be so straight-backed? For me, this pose tells me she is somebody who is used to being on high alert and seen, someone who has to be seen as strong and never to slouch. Lash can be frequently seen to be sat down in what you might describe as a thoughtful or meditative stance. However, when I think of a meditative stance, I think of a straight back, head up, not like the world's fate rests on my shoulders, like it literally does with Lash when he is not in his home city. Contrast this with how he appears when he's much more comfortable at home, and you can see the storytelling in these small poses. I love that he adds little details to characters such as Dante's sister, Gabriella, who's holding her hand on her pregnant tummy while relaxing, or when Lash appears and puts her in a dangerous situation, or she is interacting with Medusa and she's unaware who she is and whether she is truly safe. He doesn't forget about background characters too. Even here we can see such expressive poses. In this panel we can see a female hiding behind a chap in front of her, placing her hand on his shoulder, perhaps to let him know that she is there, or seeing what he is also seeing to comfort him. Next to her we can see a woman, presumably her child. She has her hand on his head, almost as if she's trying to shield him by about to turn his head into her. Step 5. Hands. When it comes to hands and Joe Mad, they're both incredibly well done and a bit strange. His hands are incredibly expressive and can be seen throughout his 3 issues to translate the energy of the pose straight to the fingers. His anatomy and understanding of how hands and fingers work are top-notch, as you'd expect from an artist of his calibre. However, he squares the fingers so much that sometimes they can look a little bit like toes? What I can appreciate from Joe's work is that he remembers that background characters also have hands and adds them to the pose, like we can see on this panel in the very first page, where I'm not going to lie, I would probably just hide the hands conveniently for, storytelling purposes, not because hands are scary. Step 6. Clothes. There's a very simple tip. Remember the line work rules that we've already talked about and keep it very simple. If we look at this panel from the introductory page of Dante, as he is leaning over and kissing his mum goodbye, his clothes and folds are very simplified. There is minimal creasing with long sweeping lines down his back and down the back of his arm. I think he does this because the pose takes priority. He doesn't want to spend his time drawing loads and loads of folds. It doesn't really make sense for his style. Let's compare the pencils to the colours, and we can see much more of the fold detail is actually added in by the colourist. And again, it's kept relatively simple to enhance the pose. When he does get a bit more complex with folds, he uses heavy rendering, utilising negative space to tell the folds instead. These patches are again, like the line work, heavy on the relatively straight side, and smart about the placement to not overwhelm. That's all I have for part 1 of exploring Joe Mad's artwork. I hope that you had as much fun watching as I had researching. It has been awesome. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like. If you want to see more videos like this and you don't mind seeing my face, consider subscribing. If you learned anything from this video, consider letting me know in the comments, because that's how I get feedback about these videos. And if you'd like to financially support the channel, there are links down below in the description as how to do so. Until next time, keep on sketching.